that. So we're going to look at a short passage from the Zohar on Parshat Noach about the Tower of Babel this evening. We read Parshat Noach last week, and if you were looking carefully, you would have seen there was only actually a few lines that make up the story of the Tower of Babel. It's not very in-depth. And the Zohar expands a lot on that story and gives us a whole new perspective on it, which is what I want to take a look at. Just a brief kind of introduction in terms of what the Zohar is. It's a medieval midrash. It's a compendium or an anthology, really, of lots of different teachings. The teachings are framed as being taught by a series of 2nd century rabbis, predominantly Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai and his sons and students. All of these are real people. There really was a guy named Shimon Bar Yochai. He really was a prominent rabbi in the 2nd century. He was Rabbi Akiva's primary student, but he probably didn't actually write or say any of the things the Zohar puts in his mouth. Rather, a series of teachings was passed on from the rabbinic period in the 2nd century up until the time the Zohar is published in the 12th century, 13th century. And probably it was kind of a snowball type effect in which core teachings were actually very ancient, but they were over time framed with new teachings and elaborated on, expanded upon, to the point where the Zohar, by the time it's published, is just a huge anthology of midrashim, loosely organized around the parasha, but often diverging considerably from the normal understanding of the parasha. The Zohar has no qualms about talking about Jewish topics, about theology, about God in very unusual ways, including, as we've seen many times together, in unorthodox ways about gender, and understanding God as both male and female, both and neither, in understanding God as being kind of a family system, a father, mother, a son, a daughter. It has no qualms about using what we would often see as very polytheistic images, and it often taps into quite ancient pagan mythologies around how we understand God and humans. So we should usually read it as a midrashic document, meaning as a commentary on the Torah, but also as a mythological document. Right? The same way that we read the Greek myths or the Norse myths, and they tell us something about what Greeks believed about the world indirectly. The same is true of the Zohar in some way, that we should read it as mythology, I would suggest. So that's especially true in this passage, because the story of the Tower of Babel becomes a mythological event. In the Torah itself, there's really only a few verses, and it's very unclear as to what it describes. A group of people after the flood moved to a place called Shinar, which is the Hebrew word for the Mesopotamian Fertile Crescent, where ancient Sumer and then Babylon was, and builds a tower that reaches to heaven, which is then responded to by God with anger, it seems, and a explanation for why there are many languages is given, that because of the hubris of the tower's builders, God scrambled all of the languages of humanity, and thus there's lots and lots of different languages, whereas presumably before the Tower of Babel there was only one. That's pretty well known. You can find that in most children's illustrated Bibles, and it's actually a story that's very foundational to many elements of Western society, how we think about language, around power, and about the relationship between humans and God. The Zohar is going to play with all of that as we look at it, and I think in really interesting ways. So we're going to look at a passage. I'm going to cut out probably the middle of the passage because it goes on a tangent. It's still rabbis, and try and ask ourselves the question of what the story is that's being told here about the Tower of Babel, how it differs from what we normally think of when we think of the Tower of Babel, and what it would mean if we took it seriously as an alternate version of this story, which many of us know but probably haven't thought that much about. Any questions about that before we dive in? No? Cool. So I'm going to share my screen, and I've just scanned the text here of the Pritzker Zohar. Hopefully everyone can see that. Again, this is the edition that's been published over the last 20 years by Daniel Matt, who's an excellent scholar and quite a serious learner of Zohar himself. He undertook a career-defining process of translating the Zohar. It took him decades, and it's hugely changed the ability of English language speakers to learn and to study the Zohar. It's actually a really good edition with great notes, as you'll see, which reference midrashim and rabbinic texts that give us context for what the Zohar is saying. And it also is very helpful in terms of its own referential nature. The Zohar often refers to itself elsewhere, and Danny Matt's really good about giving us the background on what's going on there. So we'll definitely look at the notes as we go as well. But the text is in the middle of the page, and we're going to start here where it says Rabbi Yitzchak. And again, Rabbi Shimon, when it mentions, is the protagonist. He's the main teacher. So anything that he says is usually taken more seriously. He's surrounded by his sons and students. His primary student is his son, Rabbi Elazar. And there's a variety of other kind of son-in-laws, students. There's a kind of group of rabbis that traveled around with him. In some ways, it resembles the Canterbury Tales in that we get a lot of window into their travels. And in the midst of their travels, they teach us some Torah. So, who wants to read first for us? We're going to take turns reading, if that's okay. Starting in the middle of the page there with Rabbi Yitzchak. Anybody? Robin? Lee? Robin, go for it. You're on mute. You got to take yourself off.
Rabbi Yitzchak was sitting in the presence of Rabbi Shimon and asked him, "How could these people have been so foolish to rebel against the Blessed Holy One, unanimously adopting the same plan?"
Okay, so before you go on, sorry, Robin, I'm going to interrupt you as always. What's the real question here? What's the foolishness?
Building the tower, right?
Presumably, yes. Although it's not labeled here, but it's in the context of a commentary on that section. So building the Tower of Babel. They're foolish because they rebel. Fine, not surprising. But they're also foolish because
they're doing it all in the same way.
Yeah. Seems like the question is partially about why did they use the wrong strategy? Yeah. Not just how could they be so wicked, but why did they do it this way? Everyone adopting the same plan, which is a really interesting question, not what we'd expect. We might expect a rabbi to go, how could they possibly rebel against God? The question is, how could they rebel against God and do it so poorly? Which we're going to see more of why that's the question as we go on.
Okay. He replied, "This has already been explained. When they journeyed from the east, journeying from above to below, journeying from the land of Israel and descending to Babel, they said, 'Here is a site to embrace. Let us make a name for ourselves, then sustenance from below will adhere to this site. For when judgment looms over the world, this site will resist. From here, the world will derive pleasure and nourishment, since above is too remote. Further, we will ascend to heaven and wage battle, so that no flood will pour down upon the world as before.'"
Okay, so who are these people? What is their motivation? These people who go to Babel and build this tower? And what are they trying to do? The language, as usual, is strange and poetic and bizarre. First of all, the language of journeying from above to below. That's just common. That when we talk about the land of Israel, we talk about it being up. And when you leave the land of Israel, you go down, right? You make aliyah. And when you leave, you make yerida, you descend. So that's all they mean is they pass from the land of Israel to the land of Babel, which is down from there. But of course, that's also a reference to what they were doing, because they were looking not up towards heaven, but rather to draw something up from below, which of course is assumed to be the kind of demonic, right? The assumption here is that these people were finding a place to tap into some kind of demonic energy, some kind of evil energy, which they would draw from below rather than above. And their motivation was that way when judgment looms over the world, we'll be protected. This site will resist. This place that's informed by demonic magic will provide pleasure and nourishment to the world and protect it from God's judgment, because trying to go above is too remote. Right? So there's this idea that it's some kind of strategy on their part, because remember, this is immediately after the flood. So these are people that evidently cannot forgive God for the flood, and as a result are coming up with a strategy for how to get some insurance against acts of God in the future. And the way the Zohar imagines that they're getting insurance against God is by tapping into demonic energies that come from below. And Babylon, the city of Babel, is seen as a place where that naturally happens. Hi, Maria. Yeah, Robin.
Why is why is below more accessible than above? So what's the remote thing? You can't sort of be holy enough or something. Is that it? Or
Yeah, it's an interesting question. It's not necessarily obvious why the builders of the Tower of Babel are looking below, especially because we're talking about a tower, so we're talking about building upwards.
building up?
But the Zohar imagines that they're looking for their power not from heaven, but from some demonic source below. And that's what they're hoping to use. And they're not using it just to protect themselves. It's not just insurance against God's anger. It's also a weapon.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, that last line is pretty wild. Further, we're going to ascend to heaven and wage battle. Right? These people are not satisfied with just finding somewhere to protect themselves from God's anger, lest there be another flood, but they're actually going to take the fight to God. They're going to go and fight against God as a kind of vengeance for the flood, which is wild. Lee, you look mystified.
I've got a lot of thoughts, but one of them is in Torah. It doesn't read that it's rebellious at all. To me, it reads as if it's something. Hey, we can do this, and we're going to try and do this. And God says, actually, probably best to not allow that to happen. It doesn't seem to be like striking down rebellion. It just seems to be like a sort of that there's probably some good reason to not allow that that's not quite made clear. The other thing is that if it's because it happens immediately after the flood, isn't everyone supposed to be dead? Apart from Noah and his family. So yeah. Who are they to be building it immediately after the flood?
Well, that's also a great question. The time scale, of course, is a bit kind of confused. Presumably it's long enough that there's some people around, but also it maybe shows us that the flood was more localized than is usually understood, in that there's people elsewhere. And remember, the pre-flood people are seen as both very wicked and also already kind of semi-supernatural. They're talked about as giants, right? Later, when the Israelites go to invade the land of Israel, they discover that there's some people who are there who existed before the flood, and they're humongous and they're terrified of them. So there's this kind of this mythology in the background of this whole section of Genesis that there were superhuman beings, right? Again, if we think about Greek mythology, kind of Titan-like beings who existed before, and they weren't totally eradicated, it seems, a couple of times. And maybe part of their influence is what's inspiring this war against heaven. It's proper mythology stuff, right? They're angry at God. They don't want any more floods. They're going to find a place where they can tap into demonic power and take the fight to God.
Do you think that reads like actively trying to, I don't know, kill or defeat God? Or is it more just seeking some kind of justice, like the perceived injustice of the flood?
It's a great question. It's not obvious, right? It says, so no flood will pour down upon the world as before. Might be the only way to ensure that is to get rid of this God character. There's a real sense that God feels in danger in this story, right? And you said it doesn't feel like a rebellion, but we do get a sense that God's anxious about something, which isn't the first time, right? In the Garden of Eden, God explicitly is very anxious about humans eating from the tree of life, because then they'll know all the stuff, and then there's something bad is going to happen. So there's a kind of divine neuroticism in these first 10 chapters of Genesis that makes God, much more like the mythological deities of ancient religions, which is somewhat vulnerable to human action. Not normally how we think about God. Maybe. Okay. Let's go on. Let's see how God responds. Remember, everything is in italics, by the way, is a quote from the Torah. So they're stitching the quotes in with their own explanation. Robin, do you want to read a bit more?
Adonai said, "Look, they are one people with one language from them all. Since they are all united as one, they will succeed in their project. Let all rungs disperse, each in its own direction, so that all these below disperse. What is written? Adonai scattered them from there."
Right. So they are now putting the response that we know, which is God scattering their physical presence and their linguistic unity. And of course, it makes a little bit more sense if we imagine that God is threatened by an invasion of humans into heaven, which is, again, not the plain meaning of the Torah. Okay. Someone else want to read? We can take turns. Pick up from if you ask.
Okay. If you ask why was their language scattered and scrambled, it is because they were all speaking the holy tongue, and that language aided them, for the act of enunciation is essential to attaining one's intention. Thereby they supported the place they sought to erect, so their language was confounded to prevent them from empowering their desire in the holy tongue. As soon as their language mutated, they failed in the project, since the powers above know and recognize only the holy tongue. Once language was scrambled, their power weakened and fractured.
Okay. What does this mean?
It makes me think of Sefer Yetzirah immediately. So,
good. Say more.
So they're talking about the holy tongue and the act of enunciation, attaining one's intention. About it makes me think of this idea of how in creation at the start of Genesis, everything is done through things being spoken into being. So it's all done through language and words. Right. And so if before the languages of the world, and if everyone's speaking that original creation language, then these people had sort of divine power, like sort of creative power, that was ultimately taken away from them.
Exactly. Right? Language is magic. Language equals magic. And using the right language in the right way can literally create and destroy. And that's not a new idea because that's how creation happened, as you say. So there's a sense here that these human beings had that power, and that was the danger. That's what threatened God, is that they had the divine speech. Yeah, Robin.
It's quite striking to sort of contrast this bit of it where it feels like a really powerful threat with the sort of earlier paragraph, which was, how could they be so foolish to think about to do the same thing as one? So on the one hand, it's like, I guess it was a foolish yet powerful thing, but they feel quite they're not, they as concepts, they don't sit together that comfortably, the sort of powerful and yet foolish, but I guess they can.
Well, but it's a really good observation, because it's a little bit subtle, but I think the distinction is about individual versus communal use of that powerful language, right? The individual who says a magic spell and thus changes something in the world around them doesn't necessarily provoke God's anger. It doesn't quite spike the radar, right? You can kind of get by with that. That's the Sefer Yetzirah's assumption, that you can learn the powers of language and use them to create things as an individual, as a solitary practitioner. I think what the question is here is, how could they kind of act in a way where everyone was sharing in this power as a community, so much so that it actually threatened God and thus resulted in their being scattered, right? How could they be so foolish as to make their intentions so obvious? They could have gotten away with it, perhaps, if they gone about it a different way. But by sharing in this divine linguistic power to create and destroy, they exposed themselves. Right? And this is the thing that's going to come up, is this question of wisdom and where wisdom is and whether this wisdom still exists and who can use it and how. And there's very much a sense here that the flaw of their plan was not using divine language in order to do this crazy tower, but actually using it together in a way that provoked God's anger. And part of it is that the angelic powers, the supernatural powers, the powers above, know and recognize only the holy tongue, right? This is a rabbinic statement that's said many times in the Talmud, that angels only understand Hebrew. Okay, which is funny. So there's a famous rabbinic statement that if you want to say something and not have it be heard by the angels, you should say it in Aramaic, which was the lingua franca of the time. And there's this real sense that actually there is an ontological difference between the power of Hebrew, which of course is the mysticism of Sefer Yetzirah and others, versus the rest of language, which are the scrambled, messed up versions since. And the angels, the divine powers, only know and only understand Hebrew. So if they had done this whole thing in a different way, maybe they could have slipped under the radar. I don't know if the Zohar is suggesting they should have, but it's definitely tantalizingly close to kind of being sympathetic to their aims. Even as the question is asked, how could they be so foolish? It's not clear if it's because they did something wrong, or they did something that was not necessarily wrong, but they did the wrong way. Okay, Lee, do you want to go on for a bit?
Yeah, sure. Where was I? So, come and see.
Yep.
Yeah. Come and see. A word spoken by lower creatures in the holy tongue is comprehended by all the powers of heaven, who are thereby invigorated. But any other language they neither comprehend nor recognize. So as soon as their language was scrambled, they stopped building the city, for their power fractured, and despite their desire, they could not accomplish anything.
Right, so they literally lost their power when they lost their command of the language. Right, there's a direct correspondence there. Just to point out that he gives us a reference to the rabbinic text. If one petitions for his needs in Aramaic, the ministering angels do not attend to him, for they don't know Aramaic. Right, so that's why you have to say your prayers in Hebrew, Rabbi Yochanan suggests in the Talmud on Shabbat, because the angels actually can't understand other languages, which is a hilariously human problem to have, right? Monolingualism.
It's interesting because you kind of think of, I don't know, I think the sort of the everyday idea of this scattering languages is like really quite straightforward in that if they can't talk to each other, it's really hard to coordinate and construct and complete this work. But then, yeah, it's really interesting to think that there's another layer to it where it's actually the loss of a particular language that's caused this rather than just the fact they're all speaking different ones.
Absolutely, right? That is the conventional understanding, is that it's about confusion, right? The word libalbel in Hebrew is to confuse, to be mixed up. So the assumption is what that means is that they couldn't talk to each other, they couldn't coordinate, as a result it all fell apart. But this suggests actually that's not the real meaning. The real meaning is that the confusion was that they got confused, they forgot, they lost the ability to say the words of the real powerful language. Robin, were you going to say something?
I was going to say exactly the same thing, that distinction between the confusion about whether doing it together was the thing or whether it was the language. The language itself was the thing.
Yeah. There's
a conveyed power.
There's a fabulous short story, by the way, if anyone reads science fiction, by, I think, one of the best contemporary sci-fi authors named Ted Chiang, who's written 2 collections of excellent short science fiction stories. And one of them is about the Tower of Babel. And he plays with a lot of this stuff in a really interesting way around what it meant to construct that and how they did it and whatever else. And it's a very interesting take, again, almost a midrash on the story, which envisions it a little bit differently than we do. Not quite as the Zohar does, but it's another interesting read on it. And again, it just shows us, if nothing else, I'm not saying the Zohar is right and everyone else is wrong. That would be silly. But it shows us another way to read the story that changes our perspective. And this is a very different story. We're talking about a mythological rebellion against heaven by humans who had divine power in the language they spoke. They weren't superhuman. They weren't superheroes. They didn't have magical weapons. All they had was language. But language is the powerful thing.
Is that, so in terms of the sort of timeline of it all, is that consistent in that pre this bit of the Torah, humans had more power that they were able to convey through language, and then post it, they don't?
I mean, that's not made explicit necessarily in the Torah, but there's intimations perhaps that, you know, the earlier back you go, the more like God the human mortals are. Of course, the very first and second chapters of Genesis, there's a real anxiety, again, about the similarity between this mortal being and the God who made it. Because if not for one fruit of one tree, they'd be the same. And over time, that separation seems to widen, first with being cast out of the garden, and then later with being scrambled through language, And again, as time goes on, it widens and widens and widens. And of course, the Jewish story is it widens until the point when Moses comes up onto Mount Sinai and God again comes close to people, uses language to create something new, which is a partnership. And that's the story that the Torah is telling us, is that circular story. But in Genesis, long before the days of Moses, we just see a story gradually of people losing their divine abilities, separating from God. Not too different from some stories told in other mythologies, right? Prometheus, who tried to steal the god's fire in order to help humans. You know, there's an element here where we see a kind of similar attempt to be cleverer than God, use God's power against God. And it seems they got pretty close. Okay, let's go on. Lee, do you want to read a bit more?
Sure. Blessed be the name of the Blessed Holy One forever and ever, for wisdom and power are his. Because the Blessed Holy One brought secrets of wisdom down to the world, humanity was corrupted by it and sought to attack him. He gave supernal wisdom to Adam, and through that revealed wisdom, he discovered rungs and clung to the evil impulse until the springs of wisdom vanished. Afterward, he returned to the presence of his Lord. And sun was revealed, though not as before. Later, through that book of his, he discovered wisdoms, but then people appeared and provoked him.
Okay, so we're going to see now a history of the divine power. Here references wisdom and how it was transmitted to humans, which is, of course, exactly where we're talking about. So they quote this verse from Daniel, right? The name of God and wisdom and power are his. And then they give us the sense that actually it was God who gave humans the power to defeat God, to hurt God. But that power wasn't meant to be a bad power. It's just that they couldn't handle the power. They were corrupted by the power, and thus they tried to attack God with the God-given power. It's an amazing kind of understanding of what it means to be human. Right? Given divine power, but then unable to deal with it and actually turning it against the Creator. And they give this story first with Adam, right? God gave supernal wisdom to Adam. And through that revealed wisdom, he discovered rungs, meaning layers and layers of reality. He gives us a note here, various levels of reality, including the demonic, and clung to the evil impulse until the springs of wisdom vanished. Right? So Adam drew himself towards the evil part of this power and used it for bad purposes. Afterwards, he repented, it means by returned here, and returned to the presence of his Lord. And some of that wisdom was revealed, but not the same as it was before. So there's a kind of, initially the wisdom was given completely, it didn't work out, Adam couldn't handle it, went the wrong way with it, he felt bad, came back, and God gave Adam a little bit of the wisdom, but not as much. It was more constrained and more controlled. And later, through that book of his, that's the book of Adam, he discovered wisdoms, but then people appeared and provoked him being God, capital H here. So the part that Adam retained after the initial kind of going too far and coming back was written down in a book, the Zohar believes, and it references this book many, 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 many times, called the Book of Adam or the Book of Wisdom of Adam. And it imagines that it's a book of kind of primordial divine power, which Adam had, a store of wisdom, which was given to him by God. Itself a fraction of the original wisdom given, but nonetheless extremely powerful. But other people who got their hands on this book, and again it's probably a metaphor, used it for ill, used it for naught, just as he did. And we see that history provided here. So we'll go through each of these characters and we'll get a sense of how this gradually widens that gap. Lee, you're on a roll. You want to keep going?
Okay, where did I get to? So he gave wisdom to Noah, who thereby served the Blessed Holy One. Afterward, what is written? He drank of the wine and became drunk and exposed himself, as has been explained.
Right, so Noah seemed promising at first, used the wisdom, presumably to build the ark, to save everyone, but as soon as he got out of the ark, he went off the derech, ended up naked, drunk, and messing up all sorts of stuff, killing animals and potentially sleeping with his children. So, didn't work out.
He gave wisdom to Abraham, who thereby served the Blessed Holy One. Afterward, Ishmael issued from him, who provoked the Blessed Holy One. Similarly, Isaac, from whom issued Esau. Jacob married two sisters.
Right, so we get the patriarchs. Right, so Abraham had the wisdom, started out okay, but then his son Ishmael used it to provoke God, and actually Isaac did as well through his son Esav, who of course is seen as a baddie in the Torah, and even Jacob, who's our hero, right? Jacob, who is Yisrael, he married 2 sisters, which, right, one of the often cheder questions kids ask is, if they're paying attention, hang on, doesn't Leviticus say you can't marry 2 sisters? Which is true. So Jacob himself violates something that we later come to understand as part of the Torah. So again, this is all telling us that all of these humans tried to use the wisdom of Adam, but they all failed. Even our patriarchs, even the good ones.
Do you think Esav is a baddie?
I don't think so, but he gets put into the kind of villain category.
But Jacob totally stiffs him.
Totally. It's completely unfair, but he becomes a metonym for the demonic, especially in the Zohar. Esav is the demonic. Also Rome, right? He's associated with everything bad.
Do you want me to keep going?
Yeah, let's see Moses. Moses does better.
He gave wisdom to Moses. What is written of him? Throughout my house he is faithful. There was none as faithful as Moses. He performed on all those wrongs, yet his heart did not stray into desiring any of them. Rather, he stood firm in supernal faith fittingly.
So Moses, again, the story of the Torah being that circular creation where Moses is the second attempt. Moses did all right. He used the wisdom. He used it to do amazing things, split the sea, bring the plagues, right? The implication is that all the amazing things Moses did, all the magic Moses did, Moses the magician, was done through this wisdom. Right, through the power of the divine book that he inherited. But he could handle it, right? He didn't have a great life, but he didn't go off the derech the other ways the other ones did. He managed it. He could handle it.
Well, there's also like a distinct difference in the motivation of using it, because Moses is given strict instructions on how and when to use it, and does it then, and it works, and that's good. Yeah. Whereas if it's like sort of left to your own devices with it, things go wrong.
You get corrupted by it very easily. And there's a sense that Moses kind of, definitely was tempted by that corruption to some degree. He puts himself in a position of power. Everyone criticizes him. He makes the earth swallow up Korach. Maybe not the best call. He strikes the rock to bring out water and gets in trouble for it. So he's not always perfect. But the sense here is that he ultimately tried his best to use the wisdom correctly. His heart didn't stray into using it for corrupt purposes, even if he didn't always get everything right. And let me jump a couple hundred years more.
He gave supernal wisdom to King Solomon. Afterward, what is written of him? Proverbs of Solomon. An oracle. The man spoke Litiel to Ithiel. Tithiel and Ukal. Solomon said, God is with me, wisdom is his, and I can do what I desire. Later, Adonai stirred up Satan, or Satan, an adversary against Solomon.
Okay, so this is actually quite a detailed kind of linguistic reading of the text in the Book of Kings. Solomon violates Solomon is understood to be a magician by the tradition, who could summon demons and ride magic carpets and built the temple through enslaving demonic forces. All these midrashim about Solomon, which you may or may not be aware of. But of course, he violates it by taking 1,000 wives, which is prohibited. Right, the footnote here is very helpful in that it kind of explains this particular reading. So right, in Deuteronomy, the king is commanded not to have many wives, lest his heart turn astray. King Solomon disobeyed this, offering the following rationalization, according to the Midrash Shemot Rabbah, right, in which he uses the phrase, the man spoke le'itiel, which is someone's name, to say that the only reason that the Blessed Holy One decreed he shall not have, we're going to scroll down, many wives, was lest his heart turn astray. So Solomon said, ETL, God is with me. He reread the word ETL as God is with me, v'uchal, and I will be able to withstand the temptation. But what's written of him, in Solomon's old age, his wives turned away his heart after other gods. So that's a quote from the Midrash, the whole thing. So there's this well-known Midrash that the Zohar is drawing on, that Solomon initially tried to use it for the right thing, but actually he too failed. And again, it's not surprising that sexual sins are understood to be one of the things. It's about power, though, as well. The king is specifically prohibited from having many wives, and Solomon specifically violated that. And he thought he could handle it, the Midrash imagined. He thought he could say, it's all right, I can deal with the temptation. God has given me that wisdom and that power. I'll be all right. But he wasn't. Which continues our theme of humans trying to use the divine power and failing to. Okay? So a little bit more here, and then we're going to jump. I'll just read this, and then I'll call on someone else when we jump. Come and see. With fragments of wisdom discovered by these people from wisdom of the ancients, they antagonized the Blessed Holy One, built a tower, and perpetrated all they did, until they were scattered over the face of the earth, lacking the wisdom to accomplish anything. But in the time to come, the Blessed Holy One will arouse wisdom in the world, with which he will be served, as is written, I will put my spirit within you and cause you, not like the ancients who ruined the world with it, but rather cause you to follow my laws and carefully observe my rules. One of the prophecies of Ezekiel. So they come and see, again, is the conclusion to this section in which it's saying, yeah, this is what went wrong with the builders of the tower. They had pieces of this wisdom of Adam, the book of Adam, and they used it. Again, they were corrupted by it, used it to try and fight God, to build a tower, to rally against God. And of course, it didn't work, like it didn't work for everyone else, and they were scattered. But someday, there's a promise here. Someday, the wisdom will return, and people will be able to use it correctly, and God will help us to use it in the right way and not be corrupted by it. Presumably like Moses, who was the only one who got away with using it and not being corrupted by it. Incorruptible Moses. Any questions where we are so far? We're going to jump a little bit over this story in the interest of time. I'm going to scroll down. Oh, that's very interesting. It gets very detailed. And pick up towards the end of it. What do you think so far about this idea of people contesting God, fighting against God, and this idea of the power of a book? Do you think there's some ancient primordial power, magical power that exists that people have tapped into and been corrupted by?
I find it really interesting the as I said, the distinction between, so I think there's the question about whether there is the primordial power, and then there's the question of whether sort of coordinate the power of coordination is important or not, and whether, you know, because I do believe that whatever, doesn't really matter what I believe, but I guess I do believe that there are things that people can achieve together that they can't achieve by themselves, whether that's good or bad, and there is a power that comes from collective action of some sorts.
Yeah, absolutely. There's a political element to this to some degree, right? In terms of, you know, basically we can imagine these humans, you know, organizing themselves in a strike against God to some extent, and the power of the collective versus the individual. Exactly. One person complaining about the flood is one thing. Everyone conspiring together gets God's attention. What about this idea of so it's a fairly common idea in mystical traditions. That there is a primordial wisdom, an ancient wisdom, which gave immense power to people in the distant past, which can be found and tapped into, although it's very dangerous, it's very powerful. This is one of the themes that's very prominent in a kind of stream of Greco-Egyptian mysticism called Hermeticism. It was a common idea about ancient Egypt, right? People were always thinking that they found the ancient Egyptian wisdom that would give them all this power. And here we see the Zohar subscribing to the same kind of idea. There is a book of wisdom, book again, maybe metaphorical, not a literal book in the public library, which it contains a bit of God's power that people can use potentially, but are mostly abused by.
I like all of this apart from this idea of the rebellion aspect. I mean, it might just be like a sort of like a bias, because I suppose for a long time I've had this idea of Babel being about this sort of well, you know the idea of like divine shards and souls being part of God and separating from God. I kind of thought of Babel as being like this attempt to get everyone back to God. And God's like, my interpretation of it has always been God's. It's not so much God's angry about it. It's more like, well, look, I did creation for the entire purpose of everything not being me. So there's something distinct from me. So stop trying to undo that, please. And that's so I really just like that idea of rebellion. I just think it's more like more something to do with an attempt to return to God, and a sort of naive attempt, like a naivety rather than a sort of a conspiracy.
Malicious. Yeah. Yeah, it's very different. I think probably incompatible understanding versus that reading of the Tower of Babel. Although perhaps there's an interesting idea here about, why do people thirst for the divine power? Is it just for their own aims, or is it because it connects them with something? It connects them with that aspect of God that's within themselves. What does it mean to say people are created in the image of God, as we're told over and over and over in these chapters? Maybe part of it is to have that desire to behave and to feel and to act like God, which isn't necessarily a bad thing. Although the Zohar here definitely ascribes the motivations of the tower's builders to be trying to fight and to attack God, right? He uses very violent words.
I think one thing that sort of, as you've been talking, that struck me is about what we mean by power, and I'm quite struck by the word wisdom. And usually when thinking about power, you think about physical manifestations of power and changing the environment around you physically, and thinking about that. But the word wisdom doesn't have those connotations to me, and it's a different sort of power. It's a power, maybe a power to be at peace, and the power do you know what I mean? It's sort of something different on a different level from the physical.
It's definitely an intellectual thing we're talking about.
Yeah.
Right? It's not about having Thor's magic hammer.
Yeah, exactly.
And being able to break stuff. It's about having the knowledge, and again, it's about language, about knowing how to use language to create and to destroy. That's what God has that we don't, but maybe we do have part of it. And certainly we can understand very easily how dangerous language can be, which is what this tangent was about, actually, is interpretations of language and why we're so extreme about our view of language, right? Judaism has the most restrictions on there's lots of crimes related to language, gossip, tale telling, etc., because we understand language is a very powerful thing inherently. Let's go on and read this kind of afterthought here, starting with Rabbi Chia. And see if it gives us a bit more to work with. Anyone fancy reading who hasn't? Yehuda, Maria, Charlo?
If you don't mind an Italian accent, I may.
Please.
Okay. Rabbi Hia opened saying, Adonai said, look, there are one people with one language for them all. Come and see what is written. Then they journeyed Mikedem from the east. What is Mikedem? Mikadmono, from primordial one of the world. They found a valley in the land of Shinar. The verse should read they saw. Why they found? They found I find where I find they found I find there from the mysteries of wisdom of the ancients, deposited there by victims of the flood, with which they tried to perpetrate their deed, rebelling against the blessed Holy One. They vocalized and perpetrated the act.
Okay, so thank you, Maria. So two things here. One, they're a pun, right? The text says they journeyed Mikedem from the east, and the Zohar is rereading that as Mikadmono. The word Kedem can mean either east or ancient, primordial, distant past. And so they're reading it as the primordial one, as in God. All right, so they journeyed from God. They separated themselves from God. And they went to the valley in the land of Shinar. And it says in the Torah, they found a valley in the land of Shinar. And the Zohar says that doesn't make sense. It should say they saw a valley in the land of Shinar. Why is it they found a valley? And explains that what they found there were things, mysteries of wisdom, bits of this book, secrets that were buried with the ancients who were killed by the flood. So they got there and they found something in the ground almost, right? They dug up some kind of source of power, which is what they used to try and rebel against God. And that's why it says they found. They separated from the primordial one, and they found there something which could help them to fight the primordial one. So it gives us interesting reading of those verses. And go on, sorry.
Okay. See what is written. Look, they are one people with one language for them all. Since they share a single mind, a single will, and speak the holy tongue, now nothing that they scheme to do will be barred from them, to them. No one can thwart their act. What will I do? I will derange the ranks above and their language below, so their action will be thwart. Oh, I've never seen this word before.
Thwarted is to stop someone from doing something.
Okay, it's actually very difficult English. Okay. Now, since they shared a single will and mind and spoke the holy tongue, it is written, nothing that they scheme to do will be barred to them. Supernal judgment is powerless against them. All the more so, we companions who engage in Torah, sharing a single mind and will.
Okay, so we don't want to miss with the big innovation they slipped in there at the end. So let's just take a look back, thank you, Maria, at what we read here, right? So they quote the verse, look, they're one people with one language, and they interpret that to mean they have a single mind, a single will, and all speak Hebrew. And thus God is anxious and says, now anything they do, they'll be able to do. They won't be stopped from doing it. They won't be thwarted from doing anything. They'll be able to do anything they want. They'll be as powerful as I am, right? This is the divine anxiety. And God says, what will I do? I'll derange the rungs above and their language below so it'll thwart their actions. They won't be able to do what they want. So God's only option to stop them is to mess up language, because that's their source of power. Right, and it emphasizes, since they shared a single will and mind and spoke the holy tongue, that's why it says nothing they scheme to do will be barred to them, because supernal judgment, that is divine power, is powerless against them. Right, they actually God had no ability to stop them other than taking apart language itself, the same language that God uses. And then they slip in, Rabbi Chia slips in this little thing, all the more so, we companions, those are the companions of Rabbi Shimon in the Zohar, who engage in Torah sharing a single mind and will. What's the implication?
That they got access to the power?
Yeah. Right, that in some way the Torah, understood correctly, is the book of Adam, is the source of power, and that if there's a group of single-minded, shared will companions who are completely focused on studying and interpreting the Torah, they can actually tap into that power just the same way the builders of the Tower of Babel could. A power that even God can't stop, which is wild, right? This is, I mean, a pretty radical rabbinic fantasy that just slipped in the end here, trying to, without much explanation. But it shows how how the Zohar understands what it means to study Torah is actually to use the power of language, to unpack the language of the Torah, to restructure it, to tap into it, to use it for the same kind of divine purposes that God does, and potentially to be corrupted by it the same way that the builders of the tower were. Which is, I think, a quite dramatic thing that's just kind of gradually slipped in there.
It's consistent with communal tefillot, though, isn't it? And also it really makes me think of Yom Kippur, actually.
Seymour.
The whole idea of the group coming together, sort of almost sort of bullies God into forgiveness, or I'm not.
No, absolutely, Lee.
That's quite cemented, but yeah.
No, the conventional notion of Yom Kippur is completely wrong, I think. The conventional notion of Yom Kippur, the non-mystical notion, is, we feel so bad, we're asking God to forgive us, we are, bowing before God and hoping that God, in God's mercy, forgives us for all our crimes. The mystical notion of Yom Kippur is that it's a lobbying pressure group in which we're all conspiring together to point out to God all the promises God made and to yell loud enough that God has to do something about it. It's a very different approach. And actually, there's a very radical assumption there, because what we say on Yom Kippur many, many times is, you have forgiven us. You are forgiving. You have already forgiven us, which is almost a bit of magic, right? We're actually telling God, by the way, we have the power here, right? We have the power to dictate to you what you will do, because we are using the words and the language and the ability of all of us together to act in consonance on a day in which everyone's together in shul of one mind and one purpose, to actually use that power against God. I think there is a way in which Yom Kippur is a very aggressive action, actually, which is completely like what's described here. Right? And prayer is often understood that way by the mystics, as a kind of manipulation of the divine, rather than prayer being about penitence or petition. Prayer for mystics is about protest. Right? You're complaining loud enough that God has to do something, and you're using blackmail and manipulation and guilt to try and get God to do what God's supposed to do. Which I love, by the way. I think that's the most radically modern way to understand prayer, is actually what we're doing is kind of calling God out on God's crap. Okay. Rabbi Yossi and Rabbi Chia both have something a little bit more to tell us before we conclude. I'll just read these last bits. Rabbi Yossi said, "From here we learn," so the moral of the story is, "Quarrelers do not endure," people who argue, "for as long as these inhabitants of the world shared a single will and mind, even though they rebelled against the Blessed Holy One, supernal judgment could not prevail against them." What a crazy lesson to take away from this. Right? The lesson is, don't fight with each other, because if you all agree, then you'll be able to overpower God. So it's a really good argument against not fighting with each other. An argument against arguments is that you, by fighting with each other, you undermine the divine power. As soon as they differed, as soon as they argued with each other, immediately Adonai scattered them from over the face of the earth. So Rabbi Yossi adds a little bit more of the conventional dimension to the story, of seeing them as being about one purpose versus arguing with each other, and says this is the power of agreement, and that when you're all in agreement in unison, even God can't stop you. Right, we return at the end. Rabbi Chia gets the last word. This is the last bit of Parshat Noach and Zohar. By implication, all depends on the word of the mouth. Right? Again, we've said multiple times, we're talking very much about spoken language. They vocalized and perpetrated, it said above. Here it's all depends on the word of the mouth. For as soon as it was scrambled, immediately God scattered them from there. But of the time to come, what is written, "Then I will transform the language of the peoples into a pure one, so they may all call upon the name of Adonai and serve him shoulder to shoulder." From the prophet Zephaniah, very underrated prophet. "Similarly, Adonai will be king over all the earth. On that day, Adonai will be one and his name one," says Zechariah. So Rabbi Chia wants to give us a prophetic promise of the future, that actually we will regain the ability to use language in this incredibly powerful way, to tap into the books of Adam, to do what the patriarchs couldn't, what Moses did, and what most of us are not even aware we can do, which is use the power of creation, which we possess by virtue of being creatures that use language. We have the divine power to create and destroy, and if only we got our act together, coordinated in unison, stopped fighting with each other, and understood the power of language, then we could tap into the divine power that's present, which is a really both empowering and radical and pretty wild idea. So, 4 minutes before we have to go. How does that change your perception of the story of the Tower of Babel? And if you took it seriously, what would it mean about what we do in religion? Now everyone's afraid to speak because of the power of language. Any final thoughts?
So I don't know if it's inspired by this or not. I just sort of had the thought that on a more sort of worldly level, there's like an interpretation of it where it could represent things like empire, where something grows so much and has so much influence and can be seen from around the world, and then ultimately has so many people under it that it collapses under its own weight. but I don't know. That's just sort of disconnected thought about it.
It's interesting. It's an interesting connection to make around what the symbol of the tower is and how we respond to it. Also, the role that language plays in the way people dominate each other. Right, English being a great example. The fact that all of us are speaking English, even though some of us here are not from England, is telling. Robin?
I think that a couple of things. One is that the quest for power is a good thing, sort of thing. It's something, and that religion, that we should aspire to power. And I think often we do in life, but I do wonder why. And what power. So again, I think it's sort of your definition of power and what why is having power? Is it about, does power give you some kind of deterministic power? What is it? What is the power? And why is it good to have it? And the other thing on the sort of the Zohar interpretation of the story that I find puzzling is that they keep saying, look, if you use it collectively, you can overpower God. But the fact was that they didn't. So they did have it collectively, and God was then just able to do what he did and stop them using it collectively. So
they never really answer their own question, right? As typical rabbis. Right?
There are two things, but I think that's less important to me than the first one, which is why we should aspire to. And that I guess is to your question about religion. What is it? Are we all on a quest for power? And if so, why?
I think the assumption here is one that we probably don't have as contemporary people, that magic exists, right? Magic being the ability to change things, right? Whether for good or for ill. And most of us probably don't believe that there is a power that we can tap into that can change the external world outside of our minds, that our willpower can change anything. But it was certainly commonly believed for much of human history and is still believed by many people. And similarly to what the Zohar says here, any conception of magic understands that magic itself is a neutral force. It can be used for good and for bad, much like technology, much like divine language, it seems. And partially this is a moral story about not why we should seek out power, but being that power exists, being that language gives us the divine ability, what do we do with it and why? And of course, they'll tell us we should learn Torah and use it to bring everyone in agreement and unison. But there's a dark side to it as well, clearly, which is what they want us to see.
I found it really strange when they mentioned that arguing is somehow what makes the community sin. Because in the Talmud we are used to think as arguing for the sake of heaven as a very positive quality in the Jewish community.
Yeah, you see here a much less tolerant view of that. You see a much more kind of unified, which is typical for mystics. Generally they're not as interested in the halachic back and forth. They want to establish the path that one should take, and that's something that's definitely in tension. There's two views. Well, it's been a pleasure to look at this with you guys. I encourage you to think a little bit more carefully about what you say. Perhaps, I mean, all of us probably could do that. And if we understood that language, the language we use every day, had this kind of power, we probably would be a lot more careful with how we used it, and we probably should. But whether we're aiming to fight God or bring everyone together in peace and harmony, it's interesting if we imagine walking around the world knowing that the power is there to be tapped into and what we might do with it. Hopefully it gives you at least another view on what the Tower of Babel story might or might not be about. And I'm really pleased you joined me tonight to take a look at it. So thank you.
Thank you.